Welcome to More Unfiltered. Today's guest has walked a fascinating path from early roles in sales to consulting at Bain & Company to leading global marketing at some of the top brands in tech, not limited to LinkedIn, OpenTable, Lever, SurveyMonkey, and Checkout.com before boldly stepping into her current role as CEO of Parity, an organization on a mission to close the gender gap in professional sports. But this is not just a story about career moves. It's also a story about values. It's a story about purpose. It's about knowing when to take that next leap forward. Leela Srinivasan is a seasoned executive, a proud mom of 3 beautiful girls, a karaoke enthusiast, a 4-time marathoner. We won't talk about times or speed, and someone whose career choices are deeply aligned with who she is at her core. She's also somebody that I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. We've actually talked and had long conversations during some of these career transitions. And I'm honored also to say that she took some small measure of inspiration from some of my own stories in my book, Step Back and Leap. I'm super excited to have her on the show. Welcome, Leela, to More Unfiltered.
Well, goodness gracious. It's all downhill from here, but thank you for the warm introduction, Patrick. It's great to be here.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. So looking back at your career, I mean, you've had, an amazing trajectory. And, when I look back on it, it's like you started in sales in New England. I had no idea, actually, until I did my research that you'd spent some time in Fort Lauderdale, right near where I am right now. I'm in Miami. So that was really cool to uncover. And then you seem to have had, what seems like a very straight line through your marketing career. You kind of climbed up the ladder from one company to another at LinkedIn and Checkout and Survey before making this big change to Parity, which is, not really a technology company as far as I understand, although I'm sure you are using technology and artificial intelligence. So tell us a little bit about your journey. It's like, it seems like a straight line, but I'm sure it's not. So what kind of shaped that, and what shaped your decisions going from one step to the next?
Yeah, this is, I already feel sheepish going into this journey because I admire executives who have always known exactly where they wanted to go and who they wanted to be. I cannot say the same about myself. I mean, I moved to the States from Scotland, where I grew up right after graduation. I followed a man, to be honest. And so, I ended up in Fort Lauderdale because that's where the man was, basically. Started a career in sales after a quick stint at a startup. And I enjoyed sales, but I sort of fell into sales. I fell into sales because the startup I was working at, I wore a ton of different hats. I actually started on reception.
Okay.
I answered a newspaper ad because it was late 90s, and that's how you got jobs.
You're making me feel old.
And well, the thing was, I think when I got the job, because I had a British accent, and they thought that sounded posh for their front desk. But then 6 weeks later, I got promoted to do something else. So I wore lots of hats, one of which was being the PR manager for this company, used this service called Business Wire. Really liked the Business Wire team, and they had a sales opening, and I'd never thought of doing sales before, but I really liked the product. And so I think this was sort of like my first aha moment was, gosh, if I believe in something, I can really get behind it. So I sort of took the leap, I guess, over to sales, carried a bag as an AE. They took a chance on me, moved up to New England, as you said, and managed the sales team. And I enjoyed the people leadership thing. But, you get to Boston, and I was frequently the only person in the room that only had 1 degree. Because everybody there's hyper educated. And I come from a line of educators and people who've done smart things. And I felt like I wasn't using my whole brain. So that was sort of my moment of exodus to business school. And then, so I'm sort of meandering through this career to this point. You go to business school, you go in with a plan. The plan, I had a plan, a great plan on paper, which was to come out of business school, spend, 2 or 3 years on Wall Street on as a sell side equity research analyst, and then go to a company into investor relations, really understand what the street wanted, blah, blah, blah. That was the theory. Of course, in practice, I got my shiny Wall Street internship that summer, and I hated it. Just
out of curiosity, because I know obviously, people look at this show and some of them are college graduates, and a lot of college graduates, especially at the age of AI, are thinking, what's next? What didn't work out? How did it not align with your expectations? Why did it?
Like I said, when I took that sales job, it was because I really believed in the product, and I felt like I could sell it, and I was quite successful at that. I went to spend a summer on Wall Street, and I found I felt out of place in the culture was part of it. It was with a large investment bank that no longer exists. And I struggled to find meaning in the work, quite honestly.
Interesting.
I think the combination of the culture and the work, and also I think back then, I can't speak to how Wall Street is now, but back then it was very much about FaceTime. And so, sometimes you were in the office until 2 or 3 in the morning, just to say that you were in the office until 2 or 3 in the morning. You couldn't leave, it didn't feel right to leave before a certain time or not put in a certain number of hours. And it just felt, it felt out of whack to me. So, I did figure out probably 48 hours into my internship, I was in the wrong place. Yeah, it just didn't sit right. So that gave me the rest of the summer to unfortunately work my butt off in this investment bank, but then also start exploring with my business school alumni what other paths might exist. And that led me to consulting. I think the adage is you go into consulting out of business school because you don't actually know what you want to do. And I'd say that was true of me. But it was a great move. I loved, on the whole, I loved my time at Bain and Company. It was and is a great company, superb culture, really smart, down to earth colleagues. And then, the range of work that you do is just, it's such, it really expands your horizons. It exposes you to different business problems and industries and cultures and business problems and dynamics and everything else. So it was a great extension of that business school sort of experience, I guess. But I also, if I'm honest, I never saw myself as sort of, climbing.
Career consultant.
Yeah.
Climbing all the way to partner.
Corner office is nice and all that, but I think, that was right around the time I had my first child. Had gotten married, soon after I started at Bain. And when you have kids, as you know, like everything just kind of changes. Yeah. And I realized that as much as I was enjoying Bain and getting a ton out of it, the way it works at consulting, you typically spend, 3-4 months on a case and then you rotate to something different. Some cases were amazing. Some were less amazing. And so the experience was a little inconsistent.
Yeah.
And when you then give birth to a human and you think about leaving them at home with a stranger and, giving up the parent experience for something else, I realized I was looking for something that would be more consistently fulfilling and that I knew I was going to have that fire in the belly every day I was getting. And I was just super lucky that a former Bain colleague had gone to LinkedIn. And LinkedIn was pretty early at that time. I had used the platform and thought it was pretty cool, but that was sort of the extent of it. But I really liked this fella that had gone over as a leader and everything else. And so he convinced me to apply for some things. And that was how I ended up in product marketing. It was not if I'm honest, I didn't really know what product marketing was, but it turns out it was actually a neat way to apply a lot of the skills I'd learned in consulting in the business world.
What was the major reason for wanting to join LinkedIn? When you looked at the opportunity and stuff, what was it that really kind of said, wow, this feels like the right thing for me?
I am a networker at heart. And I could see, even though, LinkedIn then was a shadow of what it has become in terms of the platform and all of the capability, but it really appealed to me, this notion of being able to connect and, build relationships and network and that sort of thing. So I liked the promise of it, even from those early stages, and I was using it. I just thought it was an interesting use of technology to bring humans together in a different way.
Right.
So it was really no more than that. I could see, I've always tried to build relationships and network, and obviously that's a huge part of being successful in sales is relationship building. And then when I was at Bain, I was the recruiting captain for Tuck, where I went to business school, and so I always just and Tuck itself as a business school is huge on community, right? There's a really vibrant alumni network. And so I enjoyed this feeling of being part of communities and building relationships and networking. And so that sort of just the basic premise of the product, I think, got me interested. You
go to LinkedIn, you spent a number of years there. I saw that you went through several different roles. What kind of prompted your decision to move on to the next thing? If I'm honest, so
in some ways, going to Bain was the last time I actually really looked for a job, because LinkedIn was sort of here, take a look at these, you should really apply for something. So it was sort of presented to me, this is an opportunity. So I put in an application form, but it was like a warm connection in. Since then, every job found me. So I loved working at LinkedIn. I, was a big evangelist for the platform. I loved the customer base. I wasn't looking to leave, in fact, but one of my former colleagues and a dear friend had gone to OpenTable, which at the time was a much smaller company. So LinkedIn, by the time I left, LinkedIn was about 6,000 people. It's now, I don't know, 20,000. When I joined, it was 500. So we'd been through that curve, which was cool. Yeah. OpenTable was about 750 people, I think, at the time. So my friend had gone from being a sort of like a manager level, senior manager type person at LinkedIn to being a VP at OpenTable, which, when you're younger in your career, titles are shiny objects that woo. So I was a director. I'd clawed my way to director at LinkedIn. I'd been, on a pretty, somewhat linear path, but just doing all kinds of different things there. And then my friend was quite crafty, actually. So she introduced me to the then CMO, basically, at OpenTable, which was looking to build its B2B marketing practice. It really didn't have much of an emphasis on restaurant relations and restaurant marketing, which, one could argue was a huge miss at the time. And so I had I just met Anne for lunch one day and we just talked. We talked about marketing. We talked about B2B, and she was articulating some of the challenges that they were facing. And I realized I had answers. I mean, I didn't know that they were the right answers, but I had ideas on ways that they could tackle some of these challenges that they were facing. And it was just it was a really engaging conversation, at the end of which Anne said, "Oh, you should meet a few more of my colleagues." And so I met with sort of the head of sales and had a very similar experience where he was very open to my ideas. And I had a lot of ideas just based on all the experience I'd gained at LinkedIn in that 4.5-year period. And then before I knew it, I had an offer. I thought we were just chatting. And then this offer came in and I had this decision point that was really quite excruciating because, did I mention I loved working at LinkedIn?
Yeah. That was very clear.
It was an absolute dilemma. And so I made my spreadsheet, with my pros and cons. And I talked to my boss at LinkedIn and said, look, I have this opportunity and I'm really wrestling with, should I take it or not? And, the scores were pretty even and I knew I would be giving up some things. I mean, it was hard for me to imagine at the time a better mission, vision, values, and culture than I had at LinkedIn. But I also liked what was on the table at OpenTable. And ultimately, I made the leap because I felt like the skills I had built at LinkedIn would be put to better use and be more impactful, given where OpenTable was in its journey.
Google published a study in 2012. I don't know if you ever read it or came across it, on high performance teams. They called it Project Aristotle.
Okay.
One of the things that they talked about in high performance teams is one of the 5 factors that determines whether a team is high performing is their ability to really understand the impact that they have on the organization. And it sounds obvious, but a lot of people, I think, sometimes find themselves in jobs where their impact isn't that clear. And it sounds like from what you're saying here, that potentially, is it a fair thing to say that maybe the reason that you decided to go to OpenTable was that you felt that you would have a bigger impact, proportionally speaking, that you could, if you stayed at LinkedIn?
Yes, I think proportionally that's true. And it wasn't that I didn't enjoy the work at LinkedIn, but and I think this is a challenge for companies sometimes as they grow. Like the next year at LinkedIn looked pretty similar to the prior year.
So the growth starts to flatten.
Yeah, I think that's right. I dug around LinkedIn. I talked to other leaders. I tried to think if I could find something that looked like a similarly appealing growth opportunity, because giving up what I had at LinkedIn was not something I did lightly. But ultimately, that was a decision I deemed to be right for me at the time. Did
you feel that the role at OpenTable was going to be a significant stretch for you? And was there a part of you that was a little bit apprehensive or scared?
Maybe I should have felt more apprehensive or scared because I hadn't worked in the restaurant sector. And one of the clear benefits of taking on this role would be basically I wasn't on the executive team, but I was one layer below. And my role was going to include biweekly one-on-ones with the CEO. And that was something LinkedIn had gotten to the stage where I love Jeff Weiner as a leader, but I would meet with him twice a year on certain topics. And it was great exposure. But, that twice a year versus twice a month was a different level of exposure to CEO, basically. So, I mean, there were some parts of it that you would have thought would be scarier for me, but I don't know. I mean, I think starting with that job and ever since, whenever I take on or evaluate a new opportunity, I'm trying to balance the vectors of like, where am I fairly confident I can add value based on my prior experience. And I had a lot, I mean, again, this series of conversations that was my interview process gave me confidence that I knew a lot and had some ideas that would be very valuable there. So there's that vector. And then there's the vector of like, where will I grow? What's new for me? And so I think I was able to get comfortable just with the balance between those two things at the OpenTable role and then at subsequent roles as well.
Okay. And so subsequently, after OpenTable, you went to several other different tech companies. There was Checkout, there was SurveyMonkey, there was Lever. Were any of those companies different in terms of your reason to join them, or was it really also that kind of like quest for growth and impact?
I think it's been a quest for growth and impact the entire time.
Okay.
I will say give the asterisk that my decision to go to Checkout was also motivated by money, quite frankly.
Okay. We all need to get paid and we all want to make more money. I mean, it's a good thing, right?
Yeah, but it wasn't the right decision.
Interesting. Can you tell us more?
Of all the leaps I've made, I had the most reservations about the move to Checkout simply because I am not from the payments industry, and Checkout is a digital payments platform.
Yeah, it's a fintech company.
It's a fintech. Yeah, they're London headquartered and have a huge international business, probably the most international business I've ever worked for, if you can believe that, just in terms of their footprint, but also just how localized the business needs to be given the intricacies of payments. So payments as a kind of like a sector is pretty daunting to get into from scratch. But what they wanted was a marketing leader to come in and build out B2B marketing from a fairly early level. And I had confidence that I could do that. I love building teams. I love mixing and matching different marketing skill sets to get to the right sort of like super group of amazing.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun.
Oh, it's so cool. Yeah.
It's
And
really cool.
I really enjoyed building that team at Checkout. But I think, back to some of the earlier lessons in, my time at, my brief time on Wall Street, which was another, in some ways, sort of motivated by money. Like money is not the motivator for me. It just doesn't, sometimes I think you have to try it to cross it out. So I think, it wasn't as motivating as I thought. And then also I think just culturally, I think there are just some differences across the leadership team there that, I was, in some ways, was also struggling to find my purpose in the way that I've been very clearly able to find that now that I'm at Parity. So, money isn't enough. And if the purpose really isn't there for me, then I find that doesn't sustain me either.
Which brings us to Parity. So, that was a huge leap for you, right? Not in the sense it's like difficult, but it was completely different industry. There is some technology involved, but it's not probably a technology first company. Mm-hmm. You're stepping into a role as CEO. It's your first time as CEO. Walk us through the decision-making process there. And, I remember talking to you when I think you had just left Checkout, and you were thinking about what's next. And, we spent some time talking about purpose, and that was like very front and center for you. Why Parity? And tell us a little bit more about that journey to find something that was really purpose-driven.
Once again, I wish I could say it was a more deliberate move and calculating move on my part to get into sports, but I was in the process of exiting Checkout and, so nearing the end of my third consecutive CMO role. And I love marketing. There's so much marketing involved in the work I do today. The role of CMO is not the most forgiving of roles.
Oh my God. Let's not go there. We need 3 more podcasts.
Indeed. But let's just say I could feel the burnout was pretty real for me, I think. So what I knew I was going to be looking for was a different seat at the table, just a different vantage point.
Yeah.
But I hadn't really thought much beyond that until I was approached. So, all credit to the headhunter that reached out, looked at my background, thought about what Parity would need, and thought I was a reasonable candidate to approach.
Okay.
So the initial reach out wafts into my inbox, and I look at this email, and then I read it again, And I forwarded it to my husband. I'm like, do you think this is real? And I say that because if I'm brutally honest, I had not really thought about working in sports.
Okay.
But I love sport. I grew up watching every sport under the sun. I played high school hockey and field hockey and tennis. I had a season ticket for Dundee Football Club in the Scottish Premier League. I think sport brings out the best in people. I really do. But I think there's something about the sports industry where if you're not from it, then you sort of feel outside it. And it's sort of hard to figure out, okay, how do I break into this? So I just had never really considered it. And I also hadn't, if I'm honest, really stopped to consider what was going on in women's sports. But I was very aware that momentum was building. So at the time that Parity approached me, and this was sort of like late 2022, early 23, the buzz was already well underway around what was going on in NCAA basketball, Caitlin Clark effect, all of that. But I'm a long time watcher of tennis and other sports where I'm quite aware of women really delivering an incredible experience for fans. But it was only when Parity put some of the facts in front of me around the sheer inequity in sport and what the experience of a professional woman athlete is really like the hard realities of what they do and don't earn. And I think a lot more of that has come to the fore in the time since I joined Parity. The facts are more known now than they ever were. And we've continued to do research on that sort of thing. But I instantly got really, really interested in solving this problem. And the problem is, when you look at the sponsorship dollars that flow into sports, there's a very small single-digit percentage of the money that goes to women's sports. You look at the salaries now in the NBA versus the WNBA, there's more visibility around that sort of thing. But for for a rookie salary in the W to be $75,000 a year, even for the best drafted player, compared to I think Wemby's first deal was $55 million over, whatever period. It's laughable. And you see this replicated around so many sports, and yet there's so much talent that these women have, because the reality is when they're not earning enough through their sport, then they have to find ways to supplement their income off the court.
Why does that disparity exist? Because clearly it's not that women are more or less talented than men, and it's not that they don't work hard, just as hard as men to be as good in their sport. So where does that come from?
In 2025, it's sort of hard to explain, right? But what I will say is, if you go back even, 5-6 years, think about the women's sport that you did or didn't see on screens, right? Media coverage has gone from 5% or less to 15% in a period of a few years. And if you can't see her, you can't be her. If you can't watch the sport, then you can't be aware of who the players are. And so it's a little bit of a vicious cycle around visibility of athletes, I think, is a huge part of why the problem has been there. It is starting to change. To me, it's such a win if I'm traveling and I'm in a hotel room, I flick on a TV, which I rarely do at home, just randomly, and I see, League One volleyball, for example, is that, on in prime time. That wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. So change is coming, change is happening slowly, but I think part of the challenge for pro women athletes is it takes a while for that, even if more money's coming into the sport, it takes a while for that to trickle down to the players. And then, of course, you've got the long tail of individual sports, Olympic and Paralympic level, where there just isn't a lot of money outside of maybe, that Olympic window or Paralympic window when these players have their moment in the sun or the snow. But, it's hard going.
Yeah, ultimately, I guess it's ad dollars, right? It's also about like how many viewers are the networks generating, right, from the sport. How big of a component do you think that is?
Well, I think it's huge, and I also think it remains a frustrating obstacle because when you ask folks in sports sponsorships how they evaluate the deals that they're doing, viewership is often the answer. But I think that underplays the value of the eyeballs on women's sports. And, there's been a lot of research done around the fact that, apart from anything else, by sheer virtue of there being fewer sponsors in women's sports, the brands that are coming into women's sports and sponsoring it are tending to leave a greater impression on the fans.
That's very
They're
interesting.
more memorable because
that's really interesting.
There are fewer brands, but also there's a different loyalty factor. I think there's more of a community sometimes around the women's game or women's sports. And I remember talking to a brand in Southern California that was sponsoring the San Diego Wave, so in the NWSL, and sponsoring the LA Kings on the hockey side. And they basically put the same offer out to the fan bases at a San Diego Wave game and a Kings game, and basically saw 3 times the redemption at the soccer game, even though the crowd was a lot smaller.
Interesting.
So just different receptiveness to different offers, different levels of loyalty, rewarding sponsors in different ways, different memorability. I just think it's I say this with my marketing hat on. Now is a great time for anybody who's looking to stand out, make a statement, resonate with fans. And we know, from our research that 73% of consumers watch women's sports at least a few times a year. It's a great time to stand out by getting involved somehow in women's sports, whether it's in a partnership with an athlete or through some sort of sponsorship.
What made the CEO job at Parity the right next chapter for you?
Well, again, I think I got comfortable with, first of all, the problem, having passion for the problem and seeing that impact needs to be made. And I do pride myself, by and large, of having picked companies over my career where I can see the purpose and I'm aligned with the mission. But this was sort of like off the charts in terms of my excitement around actually making an impact. So I think that was the single biggest driver of why Parity.
Because it's like you're stepping out when you've done marketing at such a high level as you have, and for the period of time that you have, like all of a sudden stepping away from something that you're really comfortable and really good at doing into the CEO chair. I mean, that's daunting for just about anyone, right? And I was just wondering, were there any limiting beliefs that you had to overcome to make that jump?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, in all honesty, not really, in that, we're a relatively small organization. So I'm still quite close to the work that's going on in the trenches. I've had to let go of certain aspects of marketing, and that, like retrain my brain. I don't always know what's best, by the way, just because I've done marketing for a long time. So that's been a sort of a learning, but I think it's, similar to my career. Are there enough things here that I think I'm really good at, or that I can help the team get to a meaningfully better outcome at, combined with, am I going to be learning here? Well, sure, in all sorts of ways. Some I anticipated, some I didn't. But and all credit to the co-founders of Parity who handed me the reins. I just felt very comfortable taking on the responsibility and the opportunity, having spent more time with them. So, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just didn't overthink it, and I thought it sounded fun, and I really wanted to pour myself into something where I could feel that purpose really fueling me every single day.
I think that's so important. I mean, I think, we talked a lot about purpose. And as you remember, chapter 2 of my book, I talk a lot about purpose, right? I talked about my own journey. When I look at the evolution of the job market, and obviously you were at Lever as well, so you're familiar with recruitment.
Yep.
Yesterday, or maybe it was today, there was an article that came out by the founder of Anthropic, who are the makers of Claude, the one of the competitors to ChatGPT and Gemini. And he said 50% of entry-level jobs are going to disappear in the next 3 to 4 years, which to me, I've been reading a lot about this. I've seen, 90 million jobs lost over the next, from here to 2030. There's a whole bunch of different statistics, but for one of the leading LLMs to come out and so openly say that was shocking to some extent. And I don't think that people realize the magnitude of the technological tsunami that's coming and the social implications of that. When you think about your own journey and the move to Parity and the importance of purpose, how important is finding a career of meaning and purpose now, particularly to this new generation of people who are going to come out of college and they might not find the right jobs anymore?
It's a difficult question to answer, in that, as you get further in your career, I feel like I've earned the right in some ways to to really focus on purpose. And I maybe didn't have that right earlier in my career. Like I took on that sales role at Business Wire thinking I could sell the product, but did I have the higher sense of purpose? Maybe not as much, right? So I think it is something that shifted over the course of my career. I mean, we live in it's hard to even find the right words to talk about the kind of the macro environment that we live in and the way it's making people feel. I mean, I was interviewing candidates this morning and they were just talking about how their decisions have shifted over the last 8 months based on everything going on out there. So, I mean, I definitely do still encourage people to think about what really makes them tick, what the things that they care about. And it may not be that they can find a role in those things tomorrow. But, it's okay to have goals down the road that bring you closer to things that really fulfill you and give you that sense of meaning and purpose. And I would encourage anyone out there, especially early in their career, to really get as proficient as possible or as familiar as possible with the tools and technologies that are driving this new wave, because I believe we will always need the layer of human sanity check or guidance on these technologies to make sure we're not going completely off the rails. So, I don't disagree that jobs are disappearing and that jobs will disappear. But, I think the most powerful thing that young people can do these days is to, immerse themselves and make sure that they are up to speed and comfortable leveraging those technologies, because you still, if you have that know-how, then, the tech can do the heavy lifting, but then you can still be there to make the decisions that need to be made around the outcomes.
Yeah, I agree. I think, immersing yourself in these technologies, really becoming comfortable and familiar with what they can and can't do, and thinking about, how that can shape your career evolution makes a lot of sense to me. The interesting thing was you already got a glimmer of the importance of culture from the very beginning of your career when you decided investment banking was not for you. And so I'm just wondering, in an age where AI is going to turn everything upside down anyway, how legitimate is it for us to say that young people don't necessarily have the luxury of waiting the way some of us have, but maybe need to be considering culture and purpose much earlier in their careers as a way to shape where their career is going to go, even for that first entry level job, potentially?
It's a personal thing, right? I mean, I know people who are more sensitive or less sensitive to culture. I happen to be more sensitive to it.
Yeah, same here.
So for me, it's been, I think back on certain periods of my career, thankfully few of them, but I know I was not myself when I was in certain roles because of the culture around me. And I would argue it's not worth it for anyone to put themselves through that for long periods of time. Sort of psychologically damaging. And when you can feel yourself changing as a person, you're showing up differently because of that environment. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. I mean, I also acknowledge, I mean, we all do kind of like jobs we don't want to do at some point in our career, right? I mean, I've tended bars, I've, done things like that, which, to pay bills, and, it's, we all have to work hard at different periods of our life, and it can't all be in pursuit of, something lofty and noble.
No, I agree. But
I mean, I just encourage people to listen to themselves, listen to their gut, and only you can know. I mean, I worked with colleagues at Bain who were like, what fueled them was the business problem that they were solving. Like they could fall in love with the problem, and it didn't really matter what was going on around them. That was what sustained them. If that's working, but if the culture is off, then it's more challenging for me, and I just have to accept that about myself.
How could somebody identify a culture that doesn't fit with them as they go through the recruiting process, the interview process, as they know more about the company, they meet the people, their research? How can you tell? I mean, some people they can like, you can tell. Maybe you have an intuition for it. Maybe you have just a knack for finding. I can tell as well. But I remember I went through an experience. I'd gotten a job offer to be CMO, coincidentally, at a major messaging company who shall remain unnamed. And the offer was ready to go, and I go to the office of the company to sign the offer, and the CEO was there, so he was going to be my boss. So I stepped into his office just to say hello, and he was having a bad day. I could just tell he was agitated. He was upset about something, and I was there to sign the contract. And so I was talking to him, and I said, well, just out of curiosity, what are your thoughts about paid media? I don't know why I had not asked that question in the interview, but I said, what are your thoughts about paid media? And what role do you think paid media has in terms of us, acquiring more users to turbocharge growth? He turned around to me kind of like and said, our product is more than good enough. All the growth should come from organic growth only. There should never be any budget for paid media. And that for me was an absolute deal killer. And I continued the conversation very politely, and I quietly left the building, and I didn't sign my contract. And I called the headhunter and I said, it's off. And it wasn't so much about the fact that they were not going to give me budget. It was because of the fact that this guy was obviously so wedded against the idea. And it was clear to me that he wasn't even going to brook a conversation on it. And for me, it was about the fact that also this was the CEO and the founder of the company. And those guys or girls or whoever, they set the culture. So I was fortunate enough to dodge a bullet on that one. And actually that particular company ended up really struggling afterwards, right? They're kind of an afterthought now. What's your advice for people going through the job transition process and interview process, or maybe early on in their career? How can you kind of sniff out and figure out if this is the right culture for you?
To me, it's a two-way contract, right? You're joining a company, they are thoroughly vetting you. And I definitely encourage people to do the same in reverse. And the more senior I've gotten in my career, the more thoughtfully, I would say, I've vetted companies. But there were companies I've joined where I've called people who've left to understand why they left, to get the good, the bad, the ugly. And it doesn't mean that, you're going to hear some negativity there, but to then at least have your eyes wide open to a situation or understand certain dynamics of the business has been important. I've talked to people whose job I ostensibly took over to understand, what their thoughts were on the executives around me. I've done basically like reverse reference checks on bosses, things like that, to basically just understand, are these people, what should I be aware of? Or is this a person that's going to be somebody under whom I'll thrive? So I definitely, obviously there's a lot of information out there, probably too much information. So, digging around, don't read everything that you believe on Glassdoor, but if there are trends that are visible and recent, then I think it's fair to find some way to satisfy your own kind of curiosity around whether those trends are still prevalent or if there's any, fire where you see a little bit of smoke.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, for me, the people are always going to be absolutely fundamental. In your case, you found a boss who was just going to be inflexible and rigid and unwilling to have conversation. That's obviously something that I think most people would really struggle with. So
yeah, that was a major red flag.
Yeah.
And now when you look at your role at Parity, right, and you're CEO and you're kind of like captain of the ship, how much responsibility do you believe the CEO has over culture? And what are you actually doing at Parity to drive the culture that you'd like to see there?
It's an interesting question, in part because we are fully remote. So, we're a virtual company, which, there's a whole other set of, it's another podcast probably, actually.
Yeah, that's a different podcast.
I like to think, and I really believe that it's on me to set the tone, to model the behavior, to, in some ways light the fire or inspire or think about take the lead in thinking through what are the, whether it's the frameworks or just sort of like the things we need in our culture to create enough shape and enough, structure for people to kind of slot into. It's not all on me. Especially a company of our size, every person you add changes the culture in some ways, and you hope for the better if you're bringing in the right kind of people. So I'm also trying to encourage my leaders to help, contribute the ideas, to think through, okay, this thing that we were doing as to create culture was working great, and then it's not working so well now. What will we do next? And I think especially in remote companies where you just have to be attuned to how people are evolving as they grow with the organization. Something that worked, for 6 months might kind of fizzle out or might need to be replaced or refreshed. And so you can never really sit still and say, okay, well, our culture is great. We're fortunate to have won multiple awards now from Sports Business Journal and Front Office Sports on being a great place to work. But that doesn't mean that we're going to win the next one, right? We have to keep thinking about, okay, what can we do? And, there's some practical things that we've done around equity and 401k matching. There's the benefit side of things. But then there's also like, how do you create that culture and make people feel like they're part of something incredible?
For founders, one of the questions I get asked, and I was wondering what your take on this is, how early in the startup journey do you believe founders should really start to take culture seriously?
Almost immediately.
Why?
So I think the answer is almost immediately. And I say that thinking back to my time at Lever, where I think Lever was incredibly intentional about culture from the very early days and thinking through equity and everything else. I think they had their first sort of like conversations about culture at 8 or 9 people, where it was really about how do we create cross-functional empathy? How do we build the kind of company that we want to be? And even, by the time I got to Parity, there were already, of course, like a values and culture document in place that we did some tweaking to. I mean, I think these things are also not necessarily static documents that are the same forever and ever. But, I think it's really important to have those tools basically to help guide the behavior and the way your whole team operates, really.
Leela, you've been super gracious with your time and your answers. We're kind of like winding down to the last couple of questions, in the show. One of the questions I always like to ask people, which we talked about before the show started, is around personal challenges and setbacks, and we all face them. And I think, we tend to live in a society where success, money and fame are always glorified. People don't always realize and see all the effort and all the challenge and all the setbacks that go on behind the scenes. And so I was wondering, from your perspective in your amazing journey so far, as a mom, as a marathoner, as a CEO and as a marketer, is there a particular moment, personal or professional, that kind of like sticks with you where you had a serious, setback or challenge that you can share with us? And more importantly, how did you get through it and when did you learn from that experience?
I've sort of shared around my own professional low came at has come at companies where I felt that disconnect with the culture. But I think as a mom, one of the toughest times in my career, I was at LinkedIn. I was actually working remotely. I was a group manager. I was pregnant with twins and the surprise twins. And we found out things were not going great with babies. And so basically I had gone from traveling a lot. I put myself basically on bed rest, modified bed rest, to just make sure I could have as healthy a pregnancy as possible. And I will say, if there's something wrong with your kids, it's like nothing else matters almost. And so I loved the work I was doing, but it was really, I went through probably a month of my life where I didn't know if my twin babies were going to be okay. And so I was sleeping very little. I was just, it was hard to think about much else. And I love my work. So I poured myself into my work, but I wasn't sleeping. And I was kind of a wreck in some ways. And I will say, having a compassionate boss and compassionate leaders around me who were almost like looking out for me and making sure that I wasn't online too late and I was pacing myself that was more valuable to me than anything else. So, I mean, you think about culture and, LinkedIn was growing like gangbusters and I was in a role with a lot of pressure and I had a team and everything else. But at that moment in time, nothing else mattered but just trying to make it through a pregnancy in one piece and with 2 babies. And I did, but they were born super early. And so that, that also, there was just a lot of, it was a very challenging time of my life. Flash forward, there'll be 14 next month and they're incredibly smart and bright and beautiful and amazing kids. But yeah, it puts everything in perspective, I guess.
It does.
And I had to check myself and kind of hold back a little bit from my typical high octane approach. And I needed leaders around me to remind me of what was important at that time.
How much did you share about what was happening with your team, with your leaders? Like, how open were you about it?
I shared a fair amount. I'm not sure. I don't recall if I shared the exact medical specifics, but they knew that it was not a smooth pregnancy. So
my ex-wife went through the same thing with the birth of our first son. It was a extremely complex pregnancy. She was in labor for 72 hours. She is very petite physically, and the baby was huge. And the people at the hospital refused to do a C-section because they insisted that the birth should be natural. And we almost lost them both at one point because of that. So even though I was not the person having the child, I was on the observing end, which was frustrating and infuriating and just agonizing to watch. So yeah, when your kids or the babies are under threat, that's like everything else just takes a backseat on that. I want to thank you so much for being on the show. It's been awesome. I really enjoyed listening to your stories and your evolution and your insights, and your suggestions, right, for the next generation of people and for startup founders out there. So one last question. What is your favorite karaoke song?
Oh my gosh.
Or do you have one?
It's very mood-based for me. I will say anything by Blondie, probably Call Me or Heart of Glass. Great choice.
Well, Leela, thank you so much, not just for sharing the journey, but, for leading with integrity, with purpose and courage, for being true to your values and the way you've decided to make your job transitions and leaps. And for anyone listening, if you're wrestling with what's next, maybe it's time to step back, reflect, and think of, what your own transition is. And of course, you can follow Leela on LinkedIn, on all socials, on Instagram. And if you want to know more about the amazing work that she's doing at Parity, you can check out more about it at paritynow.co. So until next time, it's been awesome from us here. Hope to see you soon. Thank you so much, Leela. All the best.
Thank you, Patrick.